1944. A 22-year-old private stands in chains in a freezing courtroom behind the front lines. His breath hangs in the air. His wrists are shaking from the cold, not fear. The charge is cowardice. The sentence, death at dawn. His own men won't look at him, not one. The colonel slams the table and screams,
"You're a disgrace to the uniform!"
The gavel rises, slow, heavy, final. Then a low rumble rolls through the floorboards, soft at first, then growing deeper. Dust slips from the ceiling. Lanterns sway. 12 German Panther tanks crest the ridge outside the building. 80 tons of steel each, crawling straight toward them. Officers dive for cover. Chairs crash. The colonel screams and hides under the table. Everyone panics. Everyone except the man in chains. He lifts his head, looks at the guard holding his cuffs. A small, calm smile appears. His first in weeks. And he whispers 6 words no one in that room will ever forget.
Unlock me. Or get out of my way.
He didn't always look like the man sitting in that freezing courtroom. But the weight in his eyes had been building long before the tanks ever came. Kleinhausen, December 1944, a village buried in snow and a place where a single decision would twist his entire life into a lie. The kind of lie that follows a man into every room, every whisper, every memory. Jack Ghost Callahan stepped into that village before dawn, his breath drifting through the frozen dark. The sky was still black, still silent, the kind of silence that makes your heartbeat echo in your ears. His boots sank into deep snow that swallowed every step, and every house around him looked dead, shuttered, waiting. 20 men walked behind him, young, cold, terrified, men who trusted him more than they trusted the officers above them. War does that. It turns the loudest men into background noise, and the quiet ones into the only truth you listen to. Jack glanced back at them. Frost stung their cheeks. Their eyes asked the same question they never dared speak aloud. Are we walking to our deaths? He didn't answer, but he didn't lie either. He just kept leading them forward. Ahead, Captain Hayes stood in the middle of the road, breath cutting the air like a blade. His voice cracked through the stillness. Form up. We advance across the field immediately. Jack felt his stomach turn. He knew that field. 800 yards of open white snow, sloping straight toward 2 MG-42 nests dug into a barn across the valley. It wasn't a battlefield. It was a killing ground. He walked toward Hayes, cold biting into his skin. Sir, you can't be serious. Hayes stared back with eyes full of pride and frost. You will carry out the order, Private. That's final. Behind them, his men stood frozen in place, watching, hoping Jack would do what he always did. Speak truth. Pull them alive through another morning. Jack took one more step. That charge is suicide. Those guns will cut through us like paper. Hayes stepped closer, jaw tight. This is war, Callahan. You don't get a say. Jack shook his head. And those boys don't deserve to die because of a bad plan. For a moment, the only thing moving was the snow falling between them. Hayes's voice dropped to a hiss. You refuse this order, and you'll face a court-martial. Jack turned toward the 20 faces behind him. One man rubbed his shaking hands together. Another whispered a prayer. Another bit down on tears. These were boys dragged into something they never asked for. Jack felt the weight settle in his chest, heavy, inevitable. He turned back. I won't send them into that field. Hayes's face twisted, red with fury. You're finished. I'll make the army remember your name for all the wrong reasons. Jack didn't respond. He didn't have to. He faced his men. Stay low. Follow me. We're taking the ditch. And they went with him. Instantly. Because trust speaks louder than rank. They crawled into a frozen drainage ditch that ran beneath the field, water up to their elbows, snow soaking through their coats, breath tight with fear. But the MG-42s couldn't see them there, couldn't touch them. They moved like shadows beneath the storm, mud, ice, darkness, until they slid behind the barn where the gun nests waited. Jack raised a hand. 3 fingers, 2, 1. They struck fast and silent. The crews never saw them coming. No one died, not a single one of Jack's men. Snow fell quietly around them as they stood there breathing hard, alive only because Jack chose to disobey. But behind them, far across the field, Captain Hayes watched their shapes disappear. And something inside him curdled, pride shattered, authority bruised. A man too proud to admit he was wrong can become something dangerous. Jack didn't know it then, but this moment, this choice, would be twisted into something ugly, something false, something that would one day put chains on his wrists. And here's something to think about as you follow this story. If you were standing in that frozen field, would you follow the officer who gave the order or the soldier who knew it would get you killed? The walk back to their lines felt longer than the fight. The ditch behind them steamed with gun smoke and frozen breath, but the men were alive, every one of them. Their hands shook, their eyes darted, but their hearts were still beating, and that alone felt like a miracle carved out of the snow. One of the youngest soldiers, Parker, barely 20, looked at Jack with a face that didn't know how to hold gratitude and terror at the same time. "You saved us," he whispered. Jack didn't reply. He just nodded because the truth was heavier than any praise. He hadn't saved them because he was fearless. He'd saved them because he was afraid of something worse than bullets, afraid of meaningless death, afraid of seeing boys he cared about torn apart because someone above them wanted glory. When they reached the edge of the village again, the morning light had begun to leak over the rooftops. The snow caught the pale sun and reflected back a color that didn't feel warm at all. The men stood there, silent, catching their breath, waiting for Hayes to appear. He didn't. Instead, Hayes stayed far across the field, staring at the tracks they'd left, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. And in that moment, the men didn't see it. But Jack did. The shape of something breaking behind the captain's eyes, not a man heartbroken by their disobedience, a man humiliated by their survival. Because if they lived without him, then in his mind, he hadn't been needed. Jack's chest tightened, not from guilt, but from the knowledge that whatever came next would not be fair. By midday, the rumors had started. Hayes's voice echoed across the camp as he stormed between tents, shouting words that carried on the cold wind. Abandonment, cowardice, insubordination. Jack heard them all from a distance, the words floating through the air like poisoned snowflakes. He didn't confront Hayes then. There was no point. Pride doesn't argue. It attacks. That evening, as the last light faded over Kleinhausen, Jack sat near a ruined pillar where the firelight barely touched his boots. Malone, his oldest friend in the unit, sat beside him. "You know he's going to try something," Malone said quietly. Jack exhaled slowly, watching the steam leave his lungs. "He already did." "You think the men will stand with you?" Jack looked over at them. Some sat eating what warm food they could find. Some tried to stop their hands from shaking. Some stared at nothing, caught between exhaustion and thoughts they'd never say aloud. "They shouldn't have to," Jack said. "This isn't their fight." Malone shook his head. "Jack, everything you've done for them? You think they don't notice? You think they'll watch you fall alone?" Jack stared through the dark. There was a strange ache in his chest, appreciation mixed with dread. "This isn't about what they'll do. It's about what Hayes will make them say." Malone's silence was answer enough. Later that night, a cold wind pushed through the abandoned village, rattling shutters and sending snow dancing under the moon. Jack lay awake, listening to the storm outside. He wasn't afraid of courtrooms or bullets or the word coward. He was afraid of the truth being twisted into something ugly, afraid that everything he'd done, everything he'd tried to protect, could be rewritten by a voice louder than his own. He remembered something his father told him back in Chicago. There are two kinds of men, Jack. Those who stand where they're told, and those who stand where they're needed. He didn't know which one he was. Not anymore. At dawn, it happened. Jack was pulled from his cot by two MPs, rifles slung across their backs, faces blank as stone. They didn't give him time to gather anything, didn't give him a chance to speak. They simply took him by the arms and led him across the camp toward a ruined schoolhouse at the far edge of the village. Inside, Hayes waited, a shadow against the broken blackboard. "This is the man," Hayes said, voice sharp. "He abandoned his post. He refused a lawful order. He endangered this unit." Jack stepped forward. "I saved 20 lives." Hayes's jaw twitched. "You disobeyed, and for that you will be tried." The MPs didn't look at Jack. No one did. And as he stood there, chained and silent, he wondered something that might linger with you too. When fear and pride collide, which one would you listen to? The voice telling you to obey, or the truth telling you not to walk into death? They marched him into the ruined schoolhouse where the court-martial waited. The air inside felt colder than the night he'd slept through. Frost clung to the cracked windows, and smoke from a single dying stove drifted in slow circles near the ceiling. Officers sat behind a broken desk, faces stiff, eyes avoiding his. No one wanted to meet the gaze of a man they had already decided to condemn. Hayes stood beside them, hands behind his back, chin lifted as if the verdict had been carved in stone long before Jack arrived. "Private Callahan," he said, "you are charged with cowardice in the face of the enemy." Jack looked at him, searching for even a flicker of the man he'd once trusted to lead them. There was nothing, only the cold shine of certainty. He said quietly, "I kept them alive." Hayes didn't blink. "You disobeyed. That is all the record will show." One of the officers cleared his throat and read from a paper with shaking hands. The words felt distant, hollow, as if spoken through a tunnel. Abandonment of post, refusal of lawful command, conduct unbecoming, a list of crimes built from lies, spoken in a room where no truth could seem loud enough. Jack stood silent. He didn't argue. He had nothing left to give the men who had already stopped listening. And then the sentence fell. Death by firing squad at dawn. The room grew quiet. Even Hayes swallowed hard at the sound of it. Jack lowered his eyes, not in shame, but in acceptance. If this was how his story ended, then so be it. He'd rather die standing beside the truth than live bowed beneath a lie. But dawn never came the way they expected. Before the first hint of sunrise touched the windows, a low vibration rolled through the ice beneath their feet. At first, it felt like a distant storm, the kind that shakes barns and rattles fences far off in the countryside. But the rumble grew deeper, heavier, closer. Dust slipped from the rafters. The lanterns swayed on their hooks. The officers paused. Hayes stiffened. Jack lifted his head. The vibration turned into a metallic thunder that shook the floorboards. Outside, through the cracks of the boarded windows, faint silhouettes moved in the fog. Panther tanks, 12 of them, moving like giants across the ridge. Someone shouted, chairs scraping against the floor as the officers dove behind whatever they could find. One man stumbled over a table, another fell against the stove. The colonel, who had once sat tall behind the desk, crawled under it now, his breath shaking louder than the wood that splintered above him. But Jack didn't move. The MPs backed away from him, eyes wide, faces drained of all color. One of them dropped the key to the shackles. Jack looked down at it, then looked at the door. He bent slowly, silently, letting the chains slip from his wrists. The metal fell to the ground with a dull thud, swallowed instantly by the roar outside. He walked toward the exit. No rush, no panic, only purpose. Outside, the cold air stung his face like 1,000 needles. The tanks were closing fast, their engines tearing at the silence, their cannons sweeping across the wreckage of the village. He stepped into the snow and moved toward the small arms shed. The door groaned open. Inside, leaning against the wall, was an old M1 bazooka with 6 rockets stacked beside it. He grabbed them. Behind him, the tanks crested the final rise. He didn't hide. He didn't run. He walked toward them, the snow crunching beneath his boots, breath hanging in the frozen air. The first tank fired. The shell screamed past him and shattered a house behind him, sending a wave of splinters across the clearing. He raised the bazooka, aimed at the slit of the viewport, and fired. The lead tank jerked, smoke bursting from its armor. Flames followed. Jack kept walking. Another rocket, another tank. A turret hurled into the sky like torn steel. A third engine died in an explosion of fire and sparks. The remaining tanks faltered, treads grinding as they panicked, reversing blindly into each other, metal shrieking. The world dimmed beneath the storm of fire and snow and thunder. By the time the 7th rocket hit, silence had begun to creep back into the village. Jack climbed onto the nearest burning hull, pulled the pin from a captured grenade, and dropped it through the open hatch. He didn't watch it explode. He just stepped down into the snow and walked forward. When it was finally over, the only sound was the crackle of flames and the soft hiss of snow landing on hot metal. Behind him, the entire company had gathered, every one of them. The same men who wouldn't look at him hours ago now stood in a silent line and saluted. Not on command, not out of duty, but because a man who had been branded a coward stood alone against 12 tanks and won. Jack didn't bow. He didn't smile. He simply turned away as Hayes stepped forward, tears freezing on his face. The captain pulled the court-martial papers from his coat and tore them apart in shaking hands that could no longer hold pride together. He looked at Jack and whispered, "I was wrong." Jack nodded once, nothing more. Then he walked into the fog, leaving only footprints behind. They never saw him again. Years later, in Arlington, every November 11th, 12 empty 75mm shells began appearing on an unmarked grave. No name, no inscription, only the quiet memory of a man who chose truth, even when it cost him everything. If this story moved you, honor it by liking the video and subscribing to Mindfront, where stories of courage live on.